The old school physique is coming back. People want to see more of a balanced, pleasing physique with an aesthetic posing routine. You know, back in our time, it was an art.
It was not a normal contest. No one was talking or acting as the way they usually do. There was a strain and tension in the air all the way through.
When Arnold retired in 1975, that was the one that was filmed for Pumping Iron, him and Jim Lorimer made a partnership, and then they announced that the following year they were going to start promoting Mr. Olympia. And then CBS did a 3-year contract with them where they were going to film the Olympia exclusively 79, 80, and 81. So in 1980, they decided to let Paul Graham from Australia promote the show. So now for the first time since Arnold retired, he wasn't going to be promoting it. So that summer, he starts training very seriously at World's Gym, him and Franco and Joseph Wilkosch from Germany. And then people were like, you know, man, what's going on with Arnold? Is he getting ready for the Olympia because he's not promoting it this year? He said, no, they're going to finally start filming Conan. So that's the reason he said he was getting in shape. So he never told anybody. And then, of course, Frank Zane used to go to Arnold every year before the contest, and he would pose for Arnold, say, what do you think? And Arnold would always give him good advice. So then that year, Zane poses for him, and he got hurt in that accident.
I had an accident where I fell into my swimming pool and basically severed my urethra, smashed my urethra, and had internal bleed. You know, it was awful. I almost died. Went into shock.
So he lost a lot of weight, and the contest was coming up, and then he posed for Arnold, and his main question to Arnold was, do you think I should still do it? You know, I'm the 3-time champ. I'm coming back as the defending champ. I don't want to risk losing. Do you think I'm good enough to win? And Arnold said, yeah, I think you could still win it. You know, I think you should do it.
But I ended up going in the contest anyway. It was an error in judgment. I was encouraged by Arnold to go in. I think he was getting even for the year before, 79, when I won the Olympia then. I embarrassed him, apparently. He asked me, he said, I was coming off stage, off stage with the trophy. He says, Frank, what's it like to win Olympia this year? I says, Arnold, it's even better than when I beat you for Mr. Universe. And that really, they aired that, and that really made him angry.
Zane said, well, what about you, Arnold? I heard rumors you're doing it. And he said, no, I'm just doing the commentary for CBS television. I'm not competing in the show. Arnold and Mike Mentzer didn't like each other at all, because after Arnold retired, Mentzer's star really took off. He started getting more popular. He was in Weider's magazine every month. He was the editor-in-chief for Joe Weider's magazine. So he was writing articles every month, and he got a lot of magazine exposure. And he started this whole heavy-duty course, and his whole concept, of course, was less volume, more intensity. Right. And whenever he did his seminars, he would always bring up Arnold. And he would say, you know, Arnold looks the way he does because he's genetically gifted. Right. But he said if he would train, he's training wrong because he's training so long. Yeah. Because if he trained like me, he would be a much better bodybuilder. So I think Arnold wanted to come back. I think he was kind of missing the spotlight maybe. Yeah. And I think he wanted to beat Mentzer. He wanted to beat Zane. He wanted to show everybody that he was still the king. So the day before the contest, they have a meeting, and Arnold comes in, and everybody's freaking out.
He went to the competitors' meeting, and this riled a few people up.
So the biggest problem was, since 1974, they started having 2 divisions in the Olympia. They had an under 200-pound class and an over 200-pound class. And I think Franco wanted that because Franco knew he could never beat Arnold, so now Franco had his own division.
Then the issue of the weight classes came up, and there was a lot of arguing going on between Arnold and a few of the guys. I wasn't even concerned about that. I didn't care one way or the other. I thought I could win. It was a very large room. There must have been maybe 50 or 60 people in there, and Arnold, as usual, wanted to be the center of attention.
Sami Binu said something, and Arnold argued with him.
But he had said something to denigrate Amir Badu in front of everyone, something that was uncalled for. He was making a fool out of himself, but at that time I wasn't concerned. I thought if Amir Badu wanted to defend himself, that was his business. So he was going through his annex. At one point, Lawyer Coe stood up as a gentleman and said, look, why don't we just let Arnold explain to all of us right here, right now, what his reasons are for wanting to have weight classes. Maybe we can get to the bottom of this instead of arguing aimlessly. And he did say it in a very gentlemanly fashion. There was no hint of anything negative in Floyd. And Arnold snapped back, "Oh boy, or why don't you stop acting like a baby? Grow up and be a man," which I thought was uncalled for.
And the comment was made about Mentzer said something and Arnold said something about Mentzer's waist hanging out.
So I said, "Look, Boyer Coe said that as a gentleman, something to that effect. He doesn't deserve that." And that pissed him off. He turned around very rapidly to face me, and he literally had his upper lip was furled around he was snarling like an animal. He said, "Oh, come on, Mentzer, we all know that you lost last year because of your big belly." And I allowed that to irritate me perhaps too much, and on impulse, I ran over towards him.
And at that, Mentzer attacked him. He jumped Arnold. And some people pulled him off. Bill Pearl was one of them.
So I guess Bill Pearl got in the middle of him, and he stopped Mentzer, and then everything cooled down.
I was surprised. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat down. I scared him. He went over and sat in the corner, and when he went to sit down, I continued at him. I was wagging my finger at him, telling him that his behavior was reprehensible, that it was not Boyer Coe who needed to grow up, but him. And he couldn't look me in the eye. He literally went from being a frantic, hysterical adolescent to shrinking away like an injured child.
Well, the problem with the two classes was the under 200-pound class was usually stacked with a lot of competitors, and then the over 200 wouldn't have as many people. Yeah. But they would take 3 from each class. They would take 3 from the under and 3 from the over for the top 6. So a lot of times there were some guys in the under 200-pound class that should have been in the top 6, and they weren't in there. So Boyer Coe went to Ben Weider and he said, from now on, why don't we just have one class? No divisions anymore. That way we'll have the best bodybuilders in the pose down. So Ben Weider said, yeah, that makes sense. So they took a vote with all the competitors, and all 16 competitors said, yes, let's just have one class, except for Arnold. Arnold was the only one. I think his reasoning was he figured the better bodybuilders were guys like Dickerson and Coe and Zane. So if he beat Mentzer in the over 200, then he'd only have to face one guy for the pose down.
Only once I stood up at the pre-judging meeting did that thing come to at least a partial halt. That irritated Ben Weider, and he stood in between Arnold and I and tried to assert himself. I just remember thinking how out of control he was. And equally as interesting was how out of control Ben Weider and the hierarchy of the IFBB were. I thought these were supposed to be the guys that ran the show. But here you had this big Prussian son of a bitch standing up acting like a Nazi. And Ben Weider, who had previously always seemed to pride himself on being in control of things. After all, he never lets us forget he's the president of the IFBB. All of a sudden, he was letting this Nazi walk all over him. He sat there quietly. I realized then that Arnold was the IFBB to a very significant degree.
Samir Bannout told me that when Arnold was training in the gym, in World's Gym that summer, he looked fantastic. He was getting big, and it looked like he was going to, be almost like the Arnold of old. But I guess he hurt his shoulder because he only trained for 8 weeks. And when you have to push it that fast to try to get your gains, he ended up injuring his shoulder. And plus, he trained with a lot of high volume and stuff. So he ended up taking a shot of cortisone before he left for Australia. Then when he gets to Australia, he's holding all this water. So Franco looks at him and he goes, "What happened?" And he goes, "I took a shot of cortisone." And he goes, "You idiot! Now you're holding all this water." So the night before the contest, the story goes, Arnold stayed up in his room all night posing for like 3 hours just to get this water out. So Samir told me at the pre-judging, he not only was down in size, I think he was only like 217.
Wow.
His legs were real thin. He had the chest, he had the biceps, but a lot of his other body parts, like his triceps were down, his legs were real down. And he was also holding water. Boyer Coe and Mike Mentzer and a few other people said that was the first time they really saw Arnold nervous at a contest. They said backstage he was very nervous.
Joe Weider told me later that Arnold was on cocaine that day. And in looking at some of the photographs later on, I believe that he had an unusually stressed look on his face. The veins on his forehead were distended. All symptoms of being on cocaine.
So by the night show, I think he looked much better. And the day after the show, he took some pictures out by the Sydney Harbor, and he looks great. I think if he would have looked like that, there would have been less controversy.
But it became very clear, especially later on as the day proceeded, that things weren't the way they should be.
A lot of the judges were friends of Arnold. You know, and Arnold obviously had a lot of friends in bodybuilding, being the king of bodybuilding, and he was a promoter of the Olympia for the last 4 years. So there was Reg Park, of course, who was his idol. He was one of the judges. Albert Busak, who was like friends with Arnold since Arnold was a teenager, he was one of the judges. They had a guy from Australia was supposed to be a judge. His name was Peter McCarthy. So Peter McCarthy was the chairman of the Australian bodybuilding. Paul Graham didn't like Peter McCarthy because he took over the chairmanship from Peter McCarthy. So he told Peter McCarthy, the judges' meeting is at this time. So Peter McCarthy was going to go to the judges' meeting a half hour before just to make sure he was there.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden somebody tells Peter McCarthy, hey, the judges' meeting is going on now. He goes, what? And he's still got like a half hour to go. So he runs to the meeting. Paul Graham told him it was an hour later than when it really was. So now he's a half hour late. So then they replaced him. They put him on the panel. And he actually judged the show, but his score didn't count. And they put this kid in place who I guess had some controversy in Australia. And this kid loved Arnold. So at the show, back then they would score the guys up to 20 points. So it would be 20, 19, 18. But it wasn't like you would give the guy first 20 and then the guy second 19. You would just score like however you thought they looked. So if you got someone like Mentzer and Boyer Coe and Frank Zane and Chris Dickerson, these guys are all top-level bodybuilders. Might all get 19s and 20s. But the guy who replaced Peter McCarthy, he gave Arnold 20s in every round. So that really, really messed up the score, and that really gave Arnold favoritism. Plus, you had Albert Busak, you had Reg Park, you had these other guys who scored Arnold 19s, 20s in every single round.
The only people who saw Arnold as the winner were the 7 judges and his closest friends. None of the other competitors saw him as the winner. None of the audience, or very few, only those that were his friends. If it was just me saying this, of course it could be chalked up to sour grapes. Although that's not true. I've lost contests before. I never raised a fuss. But that particular contest was so clearly fixed that every other competitor and many of the fans in the audience raised a fuss.
And most people to this day say he shouldn't have won the contest.
I never heard Mike Mentzer say he should ever won the contest. I think the general consensus of everybody there was the fact that the end result was not acceptable, not only to the bodybuilders there, but to the audience as well.
Jacques Blumhardt from Belgium, you know, he gave it like really accurate scoring. Dan Howard, who used to be a manager at Gold's Gym, he was also a judge, and he also scored Arnold low. I think he had Arnold in like 3rd or 4th, and Arnold didn't talk to him for like 5 years.
1980, I placed 5th at the Mr. Olympia, a contest that I and almost everyone else who witnessed it was convinced was fixed.
CBS Television flew all the way out to Australia. They had a 3-year contract with the Mr. Olympia, and they filmed the contest. They got the footage back. Now, Arnold was booed at the end when he won. A lot of people booed. They got the footage back. They were really confused. They didn't understand why Arnold won. So they called up Ben Weider, and they had the scorecards. And they said, we don't understand this. We don't understand these scorecards. And Arnold wasn't even hitting the mandatory poses. Like when they asked for a side tricep, he hit a bicep pose. So the producer from CBS was like, how can he score perfect 20s when he didn't even do the poses? So they called up Ben Weider, and they said, we got some questions before we air this. So Ben Weider sent Wayne DeMiglia to New York. Boyer Coe was in town, so Boyer Coe went, and Chris Dickerson, and this guy Sherm Edwards was the producer of CBS Sports. He took them up into the thing, and he showed them the footage they had. Boyer Coe told me, he said, wow, you could really see Arnold didn't deserve to win. You know, his legs were so skinny, and they could see it. And they were asking Wayne DeMiglia all these questions, and Wayne said, I don't know, I wasn't there. And then CBS Sports finally said, we're not going to run it. We can't run it. It's too controversial.
This Mr. Olympia contest can never be shown on television. He says it's so obvious, even from the eyes of a non-professional, that the right person didn't win. We could never put this on television. So they still had a contract for 1981. And they paid the money because they were obligated, but they never even sent a film crew to cover it. And that's the last time the major networks have ever covered bodybuilding.
And of course, in the aftermath, all the magazines carried articles pertaining to the fact that it was fixed, and as a result decided to drop out of competitive bodybuilding.
Chris Dickerson was the most finished, he was at his peak that year. He looked better that year than when he won 2 years later in 82. Chris had placed sixth the year before in 79, but after that he started winning all the Grand Prix shows. He won the Night of the Champions, and I don't know how he did it because he competed so much that year, but when he got to the Olympia, he was perfect. He was thick, he was ripped, his posing was fantastic, and Boyer Coe was also in the best shape of his life. Mike Mentzer supposedly was 10 pounds heavier than he was the year before when he only lost by 1 or 2 points to Zane.
Right.
And Zane looked good, but he was underweight. You know, he lost too much weight from that accident, so I could see him not being at his best. They looked at the scorecards and they said if that Peter McCarthy would have judged and that other guy wouldn't have, Chris Dickerson would have won the show.
The 1980 Mr. Olympia left a lot of people very bitter. And for maybe some egotistical reason, we decided that we were not going to enter the 1981 Mr. Olympia.
Boyer Coe, Mike Mentzer, Frank Zane, and Albert Beckles all said, we're not going in 81. We're boycotting the show because they heard rumors that Franco was going in it. And they said, after what happened in 1980, we know Franco's going to win. It's guaranteed. And so 1981, everybody was on pins and needles. You know, everybody thought, man, if they screw this thing up again. And so everybody was like really, really nervous.
And Franco, who was always 2 steps behind Arnold, makes his comeback from a leg injury a few years before when in the World's Strongest Man they dropped a refrigerator on his leg and broke it.
And I went to it in 1981. I had really good seats. I think I was sitting like the 5th row, front and center.
Wow.
And I saw the whole prejudging. I saw the whole night show. So they all come out. There was 17 guys. And I could not believe there was 3 guys that were never high placing in the Olympia before, and they were in their absolute best shape of their life. And that was Danny Padillia, Tom Platz, and Roy Callender. They all 3 looked amazing, like unbelievable. So Franco comes out, and he looked good. He looked really good. His upper body was fantastic. You know, he had that big chest. His abs were ripped. He was probably one of the most ripped and hardest guys in the whole show. But his legs were definitely down. The thighs were there. It's not like he had skinny legs. Like Arnold had skinny legs the year before. Franco had thighs. His injured leg was still not in proportion, but he had no cuts in his leg at all. It was like they were puffy. You know what I mean? He had no cuts. Everything else was great. His upper body was fantastic. His arms were better than ever. His posing wasn't that great. His posing routine didn't get a lot of applause. But I think if you would have polled that audience after the prejudging, I think everybody in the audience would have said the top 3 was Platz, Padilla, and Callender. No doubt about it.
I said, what happened in Sydney could never happen in the United States. Well, I was totally wrong because the same thing happened again.
They called the top 6 out. They go through the pose down. Joseph Wilcox gets 6th. And then they announced Danny Padilla in 5th. And the place erupted. Went absolutely nuts. Boos, screaming. Then they go to 4th. Callender gets 4th.
Yeah.
Again, the booing never stopped. It just started with Padilla, and it went all the way through to first place. And then they gave Platz 3rd, and then it really got bad. And then by the time they got to Dickerson and Franco, most of the audience was leaving. They gave Dickerson 2nd. Franco jumps up. Arnold and Joe Weider didn't even come out on stage.
Culumbu returns as Mr. Olympia for the year 1981.
People were going into their pockets and grabbing change and throwing it at the judges. They were throwing their programs at the judges. They were throwing change at the judges. It was insane. I'd never seen anything like it since. Yeah, I had Platz in 1st. I actually had Callender in 2nd and Padilla in 3rd.
Now, to most people, that was a bigger controversy than Arnold. You can see why Arnold could have won, but not many people can see why Franco was the winner.
They were icons. They were legends, and they were coming back. So I think all the judges, you know, they could place anybody from 20 on down to 14 or whatever.
Yeah.
And they always gave Franco and Arnold 20s and 19s just because of who they were. I don't think they realized that at the end of the day, when you added up all those points, Franco was going to come out ahead. And this one guy, Franco Fassi from Italy, he gave Franco perfect 20s all 3 rounds.
Wow.
And then that was the deciding factor. Now, if Franco Fassi wouldn't have been there, I think Platz or Dickerson would have won. And Joe Weider and Arnold gave Franco his trophy backstage.
No, really? They didn't even come out?
If you look at the pictures of Franco with his trophy, they're all taken backstage. They wouldn't dare go out there. I think after 81, they got away. They were done with the point system.
Yeah.
And they went to the placement system. So that changed a lot of things too.
The dust gradually settled. 1982 saw Chris Dickerson become the first African American to win the Mr. Olympia after more than a decade of competing. The following year, Samir Banu, the Lion of Lebanon, claimed his Mr. Olympia victory.
82, I went to London bigger than ever for the Olympia, and Dickerson won. I was a little bit too big, maybe.